Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and I have been really looking forward to this one. The incarnations of an airborne assault into the Netherlands and Germany that preceded Market Garden provide intriguing what if. James Daly returns to dissect these cancelled operations based on his two books. We did the Normandy jumps or the Normandy cancelled jumps a few weeks ago. Now we're the ones that were kind of preceding what happened 80 years ago. From Market Garden, I'll bring you in now. Good evening, James. How are you today?
Not too bad, Woody. How are you?
I'm good. So we began the conversation before we went live. I mean, this more so in some ways than the Normandy cancelled jumps, that nothing really happened similar to the cancelled Normandy jumps. Really, in a sense, the Brittany campaign ended up being very, very different to what was kind of proposed. But Market Garden and these ones we're talking about, there's these intriguing connections of things that are repeated, things that are ignored, that really get the juices flowing. Was it kind of exciting, the process we were researching these, before we get into it, because you are kind of tackling such a not taboo subject, but a well discussed subject, the whole Market Garden plan?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that will come through, hopefully, is that Market Garden really doesn't start on the 10th of September with this fabled meeting of Montgomery and Eisenhower and then Montgomery meeting Browning. It starts probably a week earlier in reality. And one of the things through researching all of this is that looking at Comet was much, much harder than the other operations because the shadow of Market Garden just looms so ever present.
Yeah, well, we'll get into it now. So James has come on with a PowerPoint like last time, lots of maps, lots of overlays, and no one knows this subject better than James, and it poses lots of questions, probably none of which we'll really be able to give a satisfactory answer to, because that is the intriguing thing about this. But it will give us some idea about more to think about with regards to the Market Garden plan, and that's why we're here. So over to you, James.
Thanks, Woody. And first of all, thank you everyone for joining us again tonight. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with my story. We've just done it a couple of times now, but my granddad was an Arnhem veteran. He died when I was quite young. And, for years I've been fascinated with Arnhem work. I was an assistant curator at the D-Day story. Always wanted to do something about Arnhem, Market Garden, D-Day. And I happened on looking at these operations that didn't happen between Arnhem and D-Day. And that's the subject of my two books. The most recent of one came out a few weeks ago. So tonight we're going to be looking at a couple of operations that are just before Market Garden, that are pretty much contemporary with exactly the time period that we're in now. But just to give you a quick overview, the operations in my second book, the one that's just come out, these start pretty much from the closing of the Falaise pocket. We're going to be looking at Linnet and Comet tonight in detail, but just to run through some of the other ones, you've got Transfigure, which would have happened between Paris and Orléans. The idea there is that cuts off the German retreat after Falaise. That doesn't happen because the drop zones are overrun. Axhead is a tentative plan for crossing of the Seine. That doesn't really go much further than some theorising and planning before and after D-Day. You've then got Boxer around the Pas de Calais, around Boulogne. The idea there is that would take out the weapon sites. That's pretty much a couple of memos that go back and forth. That's very, very inconsequential. And apart from Linnet and Comet, the other one you've got is Infatuate at Walcheren, which I think we touched on in a previous presentation, that I'm pretty sure Stephen Fisher will have plenty to say about.
And you can come back on. We're doing a sort of 10 days about Walcheren in October, so you can come on and talk about that as part of that, either on your own or as a panel or something. We'll do that.
Yeah. So, but tonight we're going to be talking particularly about the two operations that come just before Market Garden, Linnet and Comet. So the first I'm going to look at is Operation Linnet. Fortunately, this is one of the most well-documented airborne operations. There's tons and tons of papers about this. One of the things you find looking at these airborne operations is there is tons of paper, because you're talking about lining up airborne divisions with transport command. You're talking about lining them up with the ground forces. Often you've got a naval element. So there's no lack of paper looking at these operations. So, there's lots to work with, but that means lots of wading through as well. Linnet is first discussed on the 25th of August when Browning, the commander of British Airborne Corps, and his chief of staff, they met Brereton on the 24th. Brereton's the commander of the 1st Allied Airborne Army. We'll do a bit more of a deep dive on Browning and Brereton in a moment. But on the 25th, Brereton also met with de Gongen, who was Montgomery's chief of staff. And the US Air Force official history suggests that Montgomery gave his go-ahead to Operation Linnet on the same day. What's interesting about this is that Brereton's diary, which was published after the war, suggests that even on the 25th of August, when the Allies are planning this airborne operation just to the east of Lille, in very much what you'd call World War I territory, Brereton is arguing on the same day that actually he wants to launch an operation around Maastricht, Liège, and Aachen, which is completely the other side of Belgium, when the Allies have just, they've just liberated Paris, but from Paris to the other side of Belgium is quite a long way. So that does give us a bit of an indication as to Brereton's grasp of the art of the possible. But Montgomery quite sensibly chose the area around Lille, Douai, Arras, for Operation Linnet, and the initial instructions are issued on the 26th of August. Browning's designated to command it on the 27th, and the target date that's given for Linnet is the 3rd of September. This map here on the screen is one that's from the War Office files from the Directorate of Military Operations. So certainly the War Office and London are keeping a very close eye on these operations. And I think this map and the memo that came with it had a little note from one staff officer to another suggesting, I suggest this you keep this for your records. If you don't, I will. So there is a sense that these are climactic things in motion. And this is a representation of this and other maps, trying to sort of draw together what's going on in Operation Linnet. A bit of an overview. The 1st Airborne Division would have landed and captured Courtrai, which is a crossroad town with a river crossing over the Lys. The 101st Airborne Division would have landed at Tournai, and the 82nd Airborne Division north of Tournai. So effectively, they're forming an airborne carpet stroke blocking position to the east of Lille. And the broad objective really is to cut off the German retreat and to try and basically put lots of German units and troops in the bag. And it's also creating a staging post to help speed up the Allied advance, because if there's a strong position behind German lines, it just helps to move things along quicker, is the idea. It's exactly the same as Market Garden, so the same divisions. You've even got the Polish brigade taking part. Although the interesting thing with that is that the Polish brigade commander, Sosobolski, is excluded from a lot of the planning meetings, and his British liaison officer, Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, goes in his place. So a lot of these issues between the British, like Browning and Sosobolski, didn't just happen at Arnhem. These are long-standing personality issues. But it's the same size as Arnhem, the same size as Market Garden. So what was the biggest airborne division ever operation launched might have happened a couple of weeks earlier. So they were thinking along that scale.
So it's not got a direct connection in terms of geography, but it's got a direct connection in terms of the pieces on the chessboard. Because we had a question a minute ago about the readiness of these divisions. Well, the 1st Airborne has been ready for some time. The 101st Airborne have been back from Normandy since July. The early July, 82nd have been back since middle of July. So the reinforcements have been incorporated in those divisions. They're kind of ready to go, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. I mean, 1st Airborne Division are probably over ready.
Yeah,
because Transfigure, when that's cancelled, Browning has to send a memo to the division to try and keep their morale up. 101st and 82nd, the episode of Replacements in Band of Brothers covers lots of the issues of absorbing replacements and that readjusting and going off again. But Linnet is very, very similar to Market Garden in lots of ways. Different country, but you've got water crossings. So Tournai and Courtrai, you've got rivers, canals. You've got it's also about roads. So Courtrai and Tournai are both very important road networks with lots of roads radiating in and out. So if you control towns like that, you control the ability of the Germans to move to the east. Lille is a major road net.
And rail. I mean, we get the question about, I guess, rail network as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Any sort of transport. So in some respects, that is similar to Market Garden, where it's about rivers and roads and capturing key points to enable the advance to carry on. So yeah, different map, different geography, all of that, but actually the planning in terms of scale, the people, exactly the same, and lots of commonalities in terms of objectives and things like that.
And just to jump in quickly again, is that, the realization when we did the show with Phil Bradley on the weekend is that the options of where the Allies can put airborne troops is enormous, because the US Army are fighting to the west in Brittany, and they're, by the first week of September, they're pushing towards Metz, towards Metz on the east of France. So kind of all of France is, there's the dividing line between there and the army coming up from the south. They're on the brink of the Belgian border, Dutch border. There are huge amounts of possibilities of where they can go, which is causing that logistical problem that we've been talking about these last few days. So if you're kind of a junior officer thinking about something to do with airborne, you can kind of throw a dart at a map of Europe and everything's almost a possibility.
Yeah, I think because of the nature of the advance, because it's so rapid, and because it's actually difficult to keep track of who's where on the map, it's probably really quite hard trying to work out. It's probably a case of where not to go.
Yeah.
Because they're starting to reach a point of where can the transport aircraft get to? And another issue that we'll come up against is with the daylight getting shorter, that becomes an issue as well. Whereas in June in Normandy, you've got literally the longest day in terms of daylight. That becomes an issue later on in this campaign. Something else that's important about Linnet, which I suspect is why they've chosen this area as well, is that it's absolutely on the junction between 21st and 12th Army groups. So it rather neatly avoids the issue of who gets to use this valuable resource. And it's probably almost literally stitching the two army groups together in a way. Which I think is quite interesting. The idea of an operation like this happening over in an army group boundary. I doubt that's happening by accident. So that's another interesting sort of point there. And this is a plotting of the drop zones for Linnet. There were lots of map traces, and one of the things with airborne operations is lots of flimsy tracing paper with lines drawn on them that you have to then transpose onto the map, and working out coordinates from planning documents. This is basically what the drop zones would have looked like. And we can see that some of the operations we looked at in Normandy earlier, they were landing a mile or two away from the objective. Linnet, the British 1st Airborne Division, would have been landing somewhere between 8 to 10 miles away from Courtrai. So they would have had to make that approach, which is, you've gone from a mile or two a few months before to 8 to 10 miles a couple of weeks before Arnhem. So this issue of landing arguably too far from the objective doesn't just happen on the 17th of September. That's already baked into the thinking and the planning. So
which raises the question of, is that to do with confidence of the airborne troops to do their job, or kind of an assessment that the Germans are at this point of the war not in a position to react as quickly as they would have been in Normandy, or neither?
Yeah, a bit of everything, I think. I think you've got overconfidence, you've got underestimation of the German ability to react. You've also got flak. The air planners in particular are very concerned about flak, and you do have an airfield near Courtrai, and there are other airfields in this area. And as we'll see in a moment, flak, that's something that crops up in Arnhem, that the drop zones are selected because they don't want to go too close to bridges because they presume there's going to be flak there. Again, something that we think happened on the 17th of September, but actually the routes go back much further.
Yeah.
But Linnet feels much more Arnhem Bridge than Pegasus Bridge in that sense. So again, it suggests that some of these things run much, much further back. And talking about flak, this is a good example, I think, that flak plays such a huge role in the air planning. Basically, as the Allies are advancing towards Germany, they're getting closer to this belt of very heavy anti-aircraft defence that's there on the coast due to the bomber offensive over the last few years. Naturally, the Germans have put some very, very heavy defences there. Now, the air planners and airborne planning is, at this point in the war, very much dominated by air planning. So Brereton's an airman, who, naturally the air aspect of it features strongly in his thinking. So this map shows the area between about Dunkirk to Walcheren, and it's a constant belt along the coast of flak guns. Hundreds of guns in that area. Now, I don't know if you guys can make it out, but roughly sort of just in from the left-hand side, you can see these lines coming across the channel and then veering south down the map. And that's basically where the air planners have literally tried to find the weakest spot on that coastal belt and tried to almost thread the transport aircraft through it towards the drop zones east of Lille. Now, it's not a complete gap either, so they're threading it through the weakest point. So presumably they're accepting some losses, but they're really trying to keep the transport losses down as much as they can. And again, that's something that the air planners are labelled with Arnhem, about selecting drop zones that were beautiful drop zones for a drop, but really useless for actually carrying out the operation from. Again, that's happening a couple of weeks beforehand. Linnet had a very extensive air support plan. So the Allies one thing the Allies do not lack is a wide range of heavy bombers, light bombers, tactical aircraft. So in terms of dealing with flak positions and dealing with potential strong points, escorting the air convoys through, that's not an issue. There's a very extensive air plan for that. But there is caution around avoiding flak, and I think there's this argument that we have when it comes to Arnhem about, is it better to accept losses on the way in and get yourself a good jumping point, or is it better to have a beautiful drop and then take more losses once you're on the ground? That it's an argument that really the air planners have basically sort of taken control of here. Another thing with Linnet is there were going to be 2 drops in one day here, so they were going to take off at first light and land very, very early in the morning, and that would give them enough time to get back to Britain, refuel, patch up, and do another drop. That obviously changes by the time we get to Arnhem in a couple of weeks' time after this. So, although there are some very strong similarities, there are also some differences that aren't always easy to explain. And one issue here as well is that from southern England to Normandy is relatively quite far, but relatively achievable. But from England to Belgium or to Holland is much further, and in a time of year when the light is starting to shorten, there are some key differences here.
Just before we move on, just put on the flak one again. We had a couple of questions about the potential height altitude of an airborne force going over, because that flak position, the Allies are sending heavy bombers, light bombers, medium bombers, fighter bombers. Everything is going through that. So I assume there's no kind of ideal height that the airborne could kind of pick up to get through that easier. It's going to be the same whatever altitude you're at.
Yeah, I'd think so. And I think it's this bizarre situation where they are really paranoid about flak, but equally they're sending in squadrons worth of aircraft to actually attack flak positions. So I've always thought it's bizarre, the concept of fighter bombers actually attacking flak positions, because it seems the opposite of what you would want to do. But the Allies had very significant resources, which you would have thought would have brought a bit more confidence in that in that sense. So it does feel a bit of a strange contrast. I'm always loath to talk about what they should have done because I'm not a military person at all, but you would have thought they could have accepted a bit more risk in that plan. Yeah, and one thing that the Allies had a wealth of in sort of France and Belgium is intelligence. And Linnet in particular, there's a huge amount of intelligence available. The issue is partly trying to work out what German units are where. And much like before Arnhem, in the intelligence summaries, you find that they get very vague around. Rather than pinning particular units and divisions into places, it gets very we're not expecting much opposition, old men and bicycles, that sort of stuff, children's stomach battalions. It does start to get quite vague. So clearly that intelligence vacuum, or that difficult intelligence situation for Arnhem starts in late August because of the very, very fluid, chaotic nature of. I mean, there's points where the Allies don't really know where all of their units are on the map, let alone where all of the German ones are. So, you can feel for the intelligence officers a little bit. Sorry, Woody.
We had a question earlier just about the implications of the first Allied Airborne Army. So Trevor is asking exactly who are the planners? Does the body of men that were putting together stuff just after D-Day, has that changed completely with the creation of the first Allied Airborne Army? Or why is it the same personnel under a different heading, so to speak? His specific question was, who are the planners? Who is the head of planning? Presumably a team at a 2-star level reporting 21st Army Group based in the UK.
So basically, in terms of airborne planning, everyone's having a go at it. Around the time of D-Day, airborne operations are planned very much on a national level. So for the British forces, you've got Browning, who's not, to begin with, he's not commanding an airborne corps. His title is Commander Airborne Troops, in the same way that you would have a Commander Royal Armoured Corps. So it's a head of service, essentially, not an operational commander. The Americans don't have a Major General level, a 2-star level. They have, a 3-star. They have their 2-star divisional commanders. In August, everything changes. The first Allied Airborne Army's brought in. That's a lot of pressure from Washington, who wanted to see airborne forces used on an army level.
Yep.
So that's when Brereton gets given that job, because the first 5 or 6 people for it aren't available, and Brereton's about the only person they could think of to give it to. And then Browning kind of morphs from being an administrative commander to being called a corps commander. In all of the research I did, I never seemed to find any authorization for that. It just seemed to happen. And knowing Browning, like we know Browning, you wouldn't be surprised whether he just sort of decided to do it. And of course, being a Grenadier Guardsman, it's very hard to tell them no, because they've got the backing of the Crown and the Household Division behind them in terms of British Army politics. So, but also, I mean, those are the dedicated airborne headquarters, but Montgomery is still thinking a lot, coming up with plans. Each of the army group commanders, army commanders, they're coming up with ideas. Eisenhower's often chipping in. Eisenhower's getting helpful memos from Marshall and Arnold in Washington saying, have you thought about dropping 5 divisions 200 miles behind the lines and having to bat those off? So you've got this situation where everyone thinks they're an expert, and to varying degrees, not many of them are. So it's a very complex, extremely complex picture in terms of who's doing the planning.
And do you feel there's this sort of unconscious pressure to use that new airborne army? It has been created, and so they are going to use it. You don't put all that effort into creating an organization and then not use it. But people like Browning and Brereton and the divisional commanders, are they feeling this pressure coming from FDR and Churchill? Is it coming from that high that we've got this tool? Do you sense that in the archives?
Yeah, I don't know about political, but certainly from chief of staff level.
Right.
And very much coming from America, I think, because Arnold in particular sees a lot of potential in air insertion. Marshall as well, they're almost at one in this. In terms of British pressure, you've obviously got Browning, who's very keen to prove something that he's led and set up. And I think Browning's often criticised for his role at Arnhem, but one thing I think you can say is that he was a very effective administrator and a very effective political general in terms of turning airborne forces from a raiding force to a divisional level.
He's an ambassador for the professionalism of the airborne, isn't it? I mean, turning it from a kind of, as you say, a group of renegades to a high level, organized, old-fashioned regiment in a sense. This isn't something new. This is an army, and it will be managed and deployed as an army. Browning is good for that. He's grasped elsewhere, but that's one of the things, the roles he's very good at. Just that giving it a legitimacy because of his background, I guess.
And I think you've also got the aspect of economics. They've put, these transport aircraft are sitting waiting for operations, and there's a lot of pressure from Patton and Bradley to use them to ferry supplies forward to speed up the advance, and all the time they're doing that, they're not available for airborne operations. So there's pressure to actually use them for what they're meant for. They're called Troop Carrier Command, they're not called Supply Carrier Command. So there is a tension about their intended role versus what they're being pulled towards. So there's all sorts of pressures and small p politics at work here. It's a very complex situation, and you've add to that you've got a febrile situation anyway with the advance being so rapid and not knowing who's where on the map. It's a very sort of a very tumultuous time in lots of ways. But going back to the intelligence, this is a defence overprint map of Courtrai that was produced for Linnet, and it's the only airborne operation I found that had these maps. And these are very similar. If anyone's familiar, these are very similar to the beach defence maps that you get for the beaches in Normandy. So it's the same key. It plots basically trenches, machine gun positions, guns, all of that sort of stuff. So these were available for Linnet. We don't know what they're based on, presumably aerial photography. So the planners had no lack of information here to go on.
And do you think they were created for Linnet or created anyway and then set aside for Linnet?
I don't know. I would suspect Linnet, because if you created this for most of Northwest Europe, that's quite a lot of work. I don't know for certain though. That would be my hunch.
I mean, just again, it suggests a lot of there's a lot of belief that this is going to happen. If you're going down to this level of detail, that there's a sense that this one's going to go ahead. It would suggest that the time it takes for air photo interpreters to look through, and there's about 20 of these maps, the time it takes for them to do this and to produce these maps, it would suggest that there's we're going to do this one sort of feel to it. Either that or someone decided, I really want to go down a rabbit hole with proving that we can do this. There's
all sorts of...
But we knew this one, and then your book has answered lots of questions, but posed lots of others. That's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's fine if someone else wants to come along and pick up on them. That's history, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
But you do find that looking at these maps and the intelligence summaries, the assessment is very Arnhem-esque in terms of it'll only be low-grade garrison troops, units who were moving through, or people that were literally stuck. The thing about old men and children and bicycles, that sort of stuff. And this one is a slightly more close-up version of this. So all of the stuff that's red is some sort of position, whether that's a trench, barbed wire, machine gun position. And this is the centre of Courtrai, which always strikes me really, if you skewed it a bit, it could almost be Arnhem. You can see there are very minimal defences really for the size of the place. You've got a few trenches, some barbed wire. Both of the bridges are defended by machine gun positions, which you'd probably say, compared to what you'd expect, is fairly light for a division to deal with. But then when you remember that they would have landed 8 to 10 miles away, the element of surprise would have been gone. You don't know who else is in the town in terms of manpower. And in hindsight, of course, we know that the Germans were able to react at lightning speed to airborne landings much quicker than the Allies anticipated. So on paper, literally, it doesn't look hugely strong, but it's what's not on paper that's often the issue. But you can see here, Courtrai, you've got some significant water crossings, at least two road bridges, railway bridge, marshalling yards. There's an airfield at Wevelgem just off to the left, which had 15 flak guns, which is possibly why the airborne forces were going to land 8 to 10 miles away. So, and all of these things sound so Arnhem, don't they? In terms of, bridges,
Definitely lots of
airfields,
echoes,
flak.
yeah.
It basically is Arnhem in a different country in lots of ways. The first Airborne Division plan for Linnet is issued by Urquhart on the 30th of August. It would have taken 3 lifts. So, 1st Parachute Brigade, 1st Air Landing Brigade and Divisional HQ would have started landing at 8:25. So that's taking off at first light around 6-ish in Britain. The second lift would have been the 4th Parachute Brigade, and the third lift would have been the Poles, which is the same order and the same phasing as for Market Garden. So again, for Arnhem, they're not developing that aspect of the plan. It's an assumption they've already got about the order in which brigades go in. That's already sorted. The initial plan is that they'll hold a firm base around the drop zones at Rennais, which is about 8 miles southeast of Courtrai. And then Courtrai would only be captured by 4th Parachute Brigade during the third phase, which again feels very reminiscent of Nijmegen and the Groesbeek Heights and the bridge, doesn't it? That, hold a firm base first and then go for the bridge afterwards. But being captured in the third phase by a brigade who land in the second lift, it feels to me like that gives a window for the Germans to throw up some defences. And again, that feels very Market Garden-esque as well, doesn't it?
It does.
And again, it just starts to feel, doesn't it, like Market Garden doesn't necessarily start on the 10th of September. It's, there's lots more there in it.
And the problems that the geography of Arnhem gave the Market Garden planners probably would be universal problems. No matter what airborne operation you do that's going to be taking somewhere with a transport hub, you're going to have bridges, you're going to have a drop zone that you have to defend, you're going to have waterways. That there are kind of a certain universality to the problems you're going to face for this kind of operation. So, yes, those problems we think of them as being specific to Arnhem, but in a sense, they would be applicable wherever they put an operation in. I think if you're setting an operation because you want to defeat the Germans who are there, then the Germans by nature are there. So you have to work around that. It's an area that's strategically interesting to the Allies is also going to be strategically interesting to the Germans.
Yeah, and clearly the fact that they've got these defences around river crossing town, a road net town, shows that they've already identified it. And the Germans by now do have quite a bit of experience of how you react to an Allied airborne landing. So very interesting situation here. A huge amount of planning went into Linnet. Like I mentioned, it's probably the one operation that's got the most paperwork, which is great fun to look through, but hard work as well. This map, for example, and there's hundreds of maps, shows one of the drop zone areas and where the gliders taking off from particular airfields would have landed. So it's not just about drop zones, it's also about zones within drop zones. So which gliders from which lift are going to land where, which, thinking about it, of course they have to plan, because you can't have hundreds of gliders just landing wherever they want. But it does show the amount of work that has to go in. We often look at a top level map that just has a polygon drawn, but within that there's another layer or multiple layers of numbers and airfields and times and all of that sort of stuff. And particularly when you've got 2 lifts in one day, which drop zones do you use first? Who's going to land where? That's a lot of rather dull but very important staff work that has to go on. The flip side of that is a lot of these tables, these air movement tables and staff tables, are reused for Comet and then for Market Garden. So it's not always a case with these operations of saying they all took the same work, because they're lifting a lot of this planning and a lot of the preparation, which is, of course, sensible. Another thing about Linnet, which is very difficult to illustrate, is that actually, compared to a lot of the airborne operations that were planned, this one would have had some SOE and Special Forces involvement, which always seems a bit bizarre to me. You'd think Airborne Forces and SOE and Special Forces would make a very sort of effective combination. So each of the divisions would have had a Special Forces and SOE attachment to help coordinate action. The Belgian resistance was fairly well trusted, unlike at Arnhem, where there were fears about the resistance being infiltrated. You also would have had the Jedburgh parties going in, and for Linnet, uniquely, we'd have had Bardsey parties. And I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with Bardsey parties. They're effectively the same as the Jedburgh parties, but made up of Polish personnel. And the idea here that is in the industrial northern part of France and Belgium, you've got quite a lot of Polish exiles living in that area. So the idea was that it would they would help to sort of coordinate those Poles who were willing to volunteer. So that's a strategic asset and that this operation would have benefited from, that I don't think really happens in the planning for Comet or Market Garden, which seems a shame really that there's a bit of a backward step, because you'd think that fluid situation, we're not sure that we think the German resistance is light. You'd think that some SAS involvement ranging out in patrols or resistance activity closely coordinated would really pay dividends. That for some reason that just gets dropped going to Arnhem. I suspect because of the fears about the resistance.
Yeah, that is really intriguing, though, isn't it? I mean, because that came up in the last show we did about the Allies generally choosing to not trust intel coming from the Dutch resistance because of that fear that they had been broken by the Germans and previous experiences. But that by this point of 44, this was the SOE in France and Belgium's kind of a high point. The earlier years, 2 years of it all going wrong all the time, kind of they're in the past now. The Germans have had their last attempts to break these lines and stuff. This is when it's working pretty well. So that on the ground local knowledge by people who've been there, you can see that really, as you said there, assisting on the ground. When you've got a situation that's changing, you need to make a decision. Someone going, well, that's the road they would have used because that's the road they always use, or that terrain there wouldn't be suitable for this. It's really intriguing.
I mean, there's certainly times in Market Garden, aren't there, where one, the right local knowledge at the right time, and two, a willingness to listen to it would have paid dividends.
The column was moving towards the bridge. Just if you've got some local knowledge coordinating that.
Yeah, I mean, the island from Nijmegen to Arnhem, the not getting stuck in the bottleneck in the town approaching Arnhem, all of those things. Another aspect of Linnet and Comet, actually, that doesn't always get talked about is the idea of constructing rough and ready landing strips once the airborne forces have secured an area. The airborne forces would have landed these airborne bulldozers. This is one being demonstrated by American troops here. And the idea is basically they would land level ground and you'd be able to then land troops by air. And this is what 52nd Lowland Division's role is for. So they either land in sort of captured airfields or these rough landing strips. And apparently a landing strip would take 30 hours of work to construct. So whether they're working around the clock or whatever, that's not too long really. So effectively, that's enabling them to use the area they've captured as a bridgehead to bring even more forces in. And they estimated that a couple of landing strips could have handled a daily tonnage of 1,250 tons.
Wow.
Which is not inconsiderate. So if we think about Market Garden, and it's a huge if, of course, if they had been able to capture enough of an area to build a landing strip, suddenly if you're able to fly in another division and bring in all these supplies, that really could help to tip the balance in favour. You can see how that would be a real force multiplier. And
my
even
World War II TV brain is making me wonder whether or not they borrowed this idea from the other side of the world, because back in February in the WoW in New Guinea, the Australians have been dropping in bulldozers by C-47s and building airstrips to relieve forces. I wonder whether that was an idea that kind of got spread and was picked to the ETO, or whether it was the same idea had independently. But it's an intriguing thought. That would have been sort of 6 months earlier, whether that had been something that had got back from successes out in the out in other parts of the world.
Yeah, and there's even a special unit cobbled together to man these landing strips. It's the Airborne Forward Delivery Airfield Group, AFDAG. And it's basically pulled together with core troops, companies or platoons that are available. Some of the beach groups from Normandy are actually disbanded, and some of the troops, it's mainly service corps, but also medicals to supervise the evacuation of wounded. So, the Allies are very intending to use this, and they put quite a lot of work into doing it. Of course, it makes sense, really, to make use of that technological capability.
And if they're thinking of bringing in supplies to airfield, it does beg the question. Marks and Sparks asked earlier, how long of if Linnet goes ahead, how long have those airborne forces got to stay there before serious relief comes in behind them? Where are the closest ground forces?
I mean, that period's so fluid, and effectively why Linnet doesn't happen is because the drop zones are overrun.
Yeah.
So you've got this. We've talked before about this paradox that it's got to be risky enough to be worthwhile, because there's not much point dropping them if they're going to be relieved within an hour. For an operation like this, but equally you don't want to drop them the other side of Belgium, for example, where it might take 2 weeks, because clearly 2 weeks is too long, so, and I don't think anyone ever really arrives at a perfect scenario for that equation. So particularly when no one really knows exactly where the front line is. That's the tricky thing. So Linnet doesn't happen. And this is when things really start to break down between Brereton, who commands the Allied army, and his deputy Browning. When Linnet's cancelled on the 2nd of September, Brereton sort of says, no matter, we'll just move it to Liège, at the other side of Belgium. As if that's not a problem. He says, by the way, we can do it in 36 hours notice. Browning, quite sensibly, actually, doesn't agree with this, to the point where he tenders his resignation, ostensibly because of it would have meant some of the airborne forces not having maps, which is obviously quite important. But you do get the feeling this issue here is about much more than maps, because Brereton and Browning are so different. They've got such different backgrounds, different perspectives. Browning tenders his resignation, and the big mistake he probably makes is saying that I'm not just going to resign, but I'm fairly certain that my divisional commanders will as well, including Taylor and Gavin. Now, that's a huge miscalculation, because he had no right to offer their resignation, because they're a different country, a different army, but also they were never going to back him in that sense. Browning withdraws his resignation the next day when he realises that it would actually be accepted. But the damage is kind of done, because you can't threaten to resign more than once, because then it's crying wolf. But also their relationship, they're two frosty people, and you've got two key people who weren't really, were probably, I'm sure they were professional, but weren't exactly getting along how you would like them to, which 2 weeks before Market Garden, again, you can see some of these issues starting to play out, personalities and huge differences of opinion. And, I think we're heading into a huge operation with an overall commander who was 5th or 6th choice and didn't want the job, and a deputy commander who effectively appointed himself for the job but wanted his subordinate's job. So it's a very messy situation that doesn't really get resolved by the time we get to Arnhem. So on the 3rd of September, Montgomery had set the inter-army boundaries as far as Brunswick in North Germany, which I think suggests just how ambitious the Allies were. Bear in mind that I think it's 1st of September the Allies liberate Brussels. So Montgomery's thinking from Brussels to Brunswick. as an objective. On the 6th of September, Montgomery mentions Dusseldorf and Duisburg in the Ruhr in his directive. So they're thinking, the Allies are thinking very far ahead and very confidently. When Comet is cancelled on the Linnet's cancelled on the 3rd of September, Montgomery meets with Dempsey to discuss an airborne operation between Nijmegen and Wesel on the Rhine, which is probably the first iteration of Market Garden in what we would come to know it. There is a suggestion, particularly after the war, by German officers that Wesel would have been a better objective than Arnhem, because there just weren't that many German troops between Nijmegen and Wesel, whereas there were between Nijmegen and Arnhem. The thought is that the objective got switched to Arnhem because Wesel's nearer the Ruhr and there's more risk of flak. Again, coming back to flak, there's a running theme here. Horrocks and 30. So for Comet, the plan is that Horrocks and 30 Corps would have had to have captured the start line at Eindhoven. So at Market Garden, the 101st land around Eindhoven, 82nd at Nijmegen, and the 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem. For Comet, Eindhoven wouldn't have been an airborne objective. 30 Corps would have had to have reached it as their start line. So although there are some similarities, it's very, very different. The 4th Parachute Brigade. So, I'll roll back a bit, actually. First, Comet really is essentially Market Garden minus. So it's 1st Airborne Division and the Poles trying to do what 3 divisions attempted to do for Market Garden. The 4th British Parachute Brigade would have landed at Graf, the 1st Air Landing Brigade at Nijmegen, and the 1st Parachute Brigade at Arnhem, with the Poles landing as a divisional reserve. What's interesting here is that even though this is a division plus level operation, Browning's Corps headquarters was still going to go in. What they would have done, probably get in Urquhart's way, you can imagine, and generally cause a bit of inconvenience. So that's essentially Comet in a nutshell. These are the drop zones. Those of you familiar with Market Garden will notice that some of these drop zones, some of them are very familiar. We'll have a bit more of a closer look at those in a minute. As with Linnet, the air routes are drawn up very carefully to avoid flak defences. So that stretch along the North Sea coast and along the Dutch islands, that's all threaded through very carefully to avoid flak defences. This is the same air route map as for Market Garden. Again, on the 10th of September, they don't have to start from scratch. They've got all of this planning to pull out of the folder, as it were. One key difference with Comet is that it would have included 2 lifts. So the first day, the first aircraft would have taken off just after 0600 hours and started to drop at 0800 hours. The second lift would have taken off at 1554 and landed around 1745. So on the 8th of September, when this was originally meant to happen, there was enough space, they felt, to take 2 lifts in. That changes by the 17th of September. Not overly clear why, because the difference in daylight between the 8th of September and the 17th of September, you wouldn't think would be enough to change the plan that radically, but here we are. So the drop zones for Market Garden, many of them had effectively already been selected a week before for Comet. So this is the plan for Arnhem for Comet. 1st Parachute Brigade would have landed on DZX, which is actually where they did land for Market Garden, around Wolfhazer, and the glider element would have landed on LZS, north of the railway, where the Air Landing Brigade landed for Market Garden. And it makes sense because these were the 2 drop zones that were closest to the objective. So I think it's about 6 miles into the town rather than 8-9 from Ginkle Heath. So although Comet's very similar to Arnhem, there are some key differences here. At each objective, you don't have different lifts over different days. This force would have been intact in one lift. So nobody would have had to have waited around to protect drop zones. everyone that's there could have gone off into the town straight away. So there's no diversion of force, or there's concentration of effort and on an objective. Another key difference here, and this is a really important difference, is you can see that dotted drop zone just south of Arnhem. This was for a glider coup de main landing by a company of the South Staffords. Each of the bridges at Nijmegen and Graaf would have had a glider company from each of the air landing battalions landing as a coup de main to capture it. Very evocative of Pegasus Bridge. This disappears by the time we get to Market Garden.
And you have to ask why. You have to ask why that, though that doesn't happen.
You do. And there are lots of schools of thought about whether the Air Forces have just delete it because they take the time to take out what they see as a risky element. There is a suggestion that the land south of Arnhem Bridge isn't suitable. I think when they actually get there, they realise that actually it would have been maybe not for a mass landing, but for a glider company, similar to, essentially it's trying to do Pegasus Bridge. And you have to think that somebody like Major Kane, for example, we don't know which company would have done these coup de main landings, but you imagine someone like Major Kane would have had a bloody good go at it. It almost feels to me like if it's worth doing this operation, it's worth giving it a go, because the glider pilots were certainly keen to have a go at it.
I don't think you're going to struggle to find volunteers in Airborne for a high risk coup de main thing. Even if they're told, look, chaps, 50% of you might not be coming back from this. I don't think you're going to struggle within Airborne to get that. Look at the people who volunteered for Pathfinders. Look at what various Airborne commanders within the 82nd, 101st, and the 1st have been saying. I don't think that's an issue. The fact it's a high risk thing. It's going to come down to the air thing, and I think that's a recurring theme in the sidebar is the Brereton Browning Air Force or air element and the ground element, and the compromise and differences between those two factors seem to be key to a lot of things here. One of the questions we had was the aggro between Browning and Brereton due to Army versus Air Force into rivalry over who will run the Airborne better. And Mad Cat saying first consideration for any airborne operations are, do we have enough aircraft and how many will we lose? And you said that earlier on. Is it better to have an intact force going a safer route, getting there, but a worse drop zone, or get them or accept you're going to lose some aircraft on there? And there's no answer to that, because each side of this, the air part and the ground part, including paratroopers as part of the ground part in terms of that's their role on the ground, they have their views, and there's no real, it's not like you can look up in a book what the answer to that is. It's just the application will tell you whether which version is correct. In a sense, there's no right or wrong.
And I think one of the things with airborne warfare is that this is being done on the job.
Exactly.
There is theory and there are field manuals, but it's still quite embryonic. It's kind of similar to tanks towards the end of the First World War. So by the time you get to 1944, the British Army, for example, have had decades to work out tank policy. Airborne Forces, they've been doing it for a couple of years, and certainly not on this scale. So they're trying to develop policy and implement it at the same time, which I think we do have to give them a certain leeway for that. This is highly experimental in many ways. And this is a map that I had drawn up just to try and make sense of that sketch map. And you can see how it's a much smaller operation, but much more concentrated. There'd be less waiting around holding drop zones. There's, they don't have to make, for 4th Parachute Brigade, don't have to make it from Ginkle Heath, the furthest drop zone, to Arnhem. Interestingly, 1st Parachute Brigade's plan for Comet is exactly the same as it is for Arnhem. So sending the 3 battalions down different routes. They're literally called Lion, Leopard and Tiger, the same. So Lathbury's brigade, basically for Market Garden, it's Ashur chaps in terms of same plan. So, there's lots of borrowing of stuff here. And it generally just looks, although it's a smaller plan, it generally, to me, looks neater and tidier, with much less moving parts. And I think one of the obvious things to think about Comet is that if it was a disaster for Market Garden, it would have been a disaster for Comet. But what's important to remember is that Comet would have been potentially 9 days before Market Garden, and at that time in early September, a day could have been a huge difference in terms of what the German opposition would have been.
There was that definite period where the Germans, I know we're kind of looking at the movie version of it, but it is true. They're going from being a kind of a rabble to organized. It came up in some of the other shows last week that the Allies had kind of misunderstood the ability for these kind of German training units and reserve units to get their act together and start putting a defense in. But, you know, as you say, 9-10 days earlier, I mean, it's a big if, but would that have made the difference? Would that have caused some of these German units to not galvanize in the way they did? It's fantastic to think about, even if we can't give an answer.
Yeah, it's difficult to know for certain, partly because the German situation is so chaotic. And also, you know, if someone ever did really want to do a deep dive on that way, I'm sure somebody probably already has. But it strikes me that it's not so much bridge too far, but too far from the bridge, but also a week too late. The window of opportunity does feel like it's around this time. So just a quick look at some of the other sketch maps. This is the southern portion of the operation around Nijmegen and Graaf. So 4th Parachute Brigade would have landed very close to Graaf. You know, you'd think that would be quite effective, but it's interesting that 1st Air Landing Brigade, their drop zones around Groesbeek, very similar to 82nd for, actually it's very the same, isn't it really, as 82nd Division for Market Garden. 1st Air Landing Brigade would also have been complicated by Hicks would have had Urquhart and Browning looking over his shoulder, and you can't think that would have been particularly comfortable. So again, all these issues of do you go straight to the town, do you hold Groesbeek Heights, that sort of stuff, that wasn't just an issue from the 17th of September, that would have been an issue from the 8th to the 10th as well, potentially. And, you know, the planning for these operations was extremely detailed. This is a sketch of 4th Parachute Brigade's plan, so my granddad's brigade, of the drop zone and then their consolidation around the objective. And there's a lot of work around where do battalions go, where do the attached arms go, so the field ambulance, the engineers, all of that stuff. And you can replicate this for every brigade, every battalion in many respects. It's hugely complicated. But one of the things here about the 4th Brigade at Graaf would have been that it's a relatively short distance, a smaller force, but more concentrated. So it's difficult comparing apples with pears, but they're very different and also very similar at the same time. Comet really starts to hit the rails on the 8th of September. Horrocks reports to Dempsey that operations stiffened around the Albert Canal. So the Germans have started to throw up some Kampfgruppen to hold back the Allied advance. Dempsey temporarily postpones Comet, still hoping to launch it on the 9th or the 10th, but it's cancelled altogether on the 10th of September. And that's the day that we know that Montgomery meets with Eisenhower and then meets with Dempsey and Browning. And that's when Dempsey asks for a 3-division operation. So they still see merit in Comet, but they just want to scale it up. So their solution to opposition getting stiffer is we'll just go higher, which for Montgomery and Dempsey, both two very cautious, sensible, logical people, that feels like a real, you know, we've talked before, haven't we, how people castigate Montgomery for being cautious and for being reckless. It's a bit more complicated than that, isn't it?
Well, this is what, you know, we said before going live is that the Market Garden plan isn't a single person's concept. It has come out of these various incarnations with lots of people putting there saying we're going to do some questions later on, but there's people that don't even come to it's always why did Montgomery, but Dempsey's involvement, Horrocks, Brereton, RAF planners. There are lots of people who are having a say in this. Okay, Montgomery carries the rank, and so does Eisenhower at a certain point. But this idea that it's something, Cobra was literally put together by Bradley in his tent in Normandy, and then he gave it to the corps commanders kind of out of the box. But Market Garden doesn't have that genesis, does it?
No, it's partly. I mean, you've got everyone involved in some way or other because of the nature of airborne operations. It needs a lot of combined operations approach. You've got an evolution from Linnet to Comet to Market Garden. You've got different nationalities. You've got that heady atmosphere about the advance and the mixed intelligence picture. I know Arnhem's often categorized as a catalogue of errors, as one of the older books, isn't it? But it's a catalogue of factors, I think you'd say, and it starts long before the 10th of September in many ways. If we just start looking at Arnhem at the 10th of September, we're too late in more ways than one. Of course, as we know, at Market Garden, arguably 3 divisions wasn't enough. Either that or it was a week too late, or both.
It's too simple to just say, as people do, Market Garden was a bad plan. It's an easy sentence to say there, and part of me kind of wants to say that, but there are too many factors that within the details of Market Garden plan, there are good bits and there are bad bits, and the implication of them, there are good bits and bad bits. It's just saying the plan was bad or good is oversimplifying it, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's what makes Comet particularly hard to analyze, and Market Garden in a roundabout way, is the shadow of Market Garden.
Yeah.
Because Market Garden very much happened and everyone's got very strong opinions about it. It casts such a shadow, not just with historians, but with veterans about their recollections of how Comet might have gone or how Linnet might have gone.
Well, there's a bitterness around Market Garden, both from some of the participants and also some of the people who comment on it. And there are certain people, and I welcome their comments on World War II TV, who've been commenting on the Market Garden program, as I've done since the very beginning, who have not changed their opinions about who they think is at fault or where it went wrong. And some of these people carry on these arguments amongst themselves for months after the show's air. And that's totally fine. I enjoy reading all the stuff, but people have got particularly entrenched over their Market Garden. There's a protective element. It's people like yourself who had a relative involved. That adds another level of personal impact by it, is that so many people's granddads did go into the bag or were captured or were killed. And so that adds that other element there. So it is an interesting dilemma, this whole Market Garden debate, because people get quite het up about it, understandably.
Yeah, I mean, the veterans, so Urquhart, in his oral history interview in the Imperial War Museum, felt that Comet might have worked because he obviously was party to more information about the state the Germans were in. He felt that it might have worked. I think the key word is might. He's not saying yes, he's not saying no. Yeah. Hackett, on the other hand, as you'd expect with someone with a strong character, thought that it would have been a disaster. Yeah, he thought Market Garden was going to be a disaster, so he was obviously going to think Comet would have been. Major Tony Hibbert, who was the brigade major at 1st Parachute Brigade, he felt that it could have worked. So, Hibbert is someone who would have been party to the intelligence assessments and a lot of planning. So even the veterans don't agree. And I think it's so obviously when people have taken part in an event like Market Garden that is so formative and so casts such a shadow over people's lives, of course it's going to affect how they view things that would have gone before or would have been very similar. It's really interesting trying to pick that apart, and I think that's a good metaphor for veterans in total, really, about how these events that effectively lasted for 9 days can completely dominate the perspective on so many things. And I've said this before, but one of the people I probably feel most for in all of this is Major General Roy Urquhart, who commands the 1st Airborne Division, who is a very competent, very experienced commander. He's been a chief of staff in the Middle East, in North Africa. He's commanded a brigade. He's been a chief of staff of a corps in Britain. You know, he's done staff and he's done commanding at the front line. There's an extremely high tempo of planning and standing by since D-Day. His boss Browning wanted his job. So there's in Italy, when the 1st Airborne Division was there, when the commander Hopkinson was killed, Browning wanted to take over because he wanted to command a division in action. So Urquhart's got this situation where his boss probably wants his job. Browning doesn't get on with Brereton, his boss. Can't have been a very nice place to be, really, in lots of ways. He's got a division that's scattered all over large parts of England. Browning cuts him out of a lot of the planning. So there are meetings where Taylor and Gavin are invited to, but Urquhart isn't. Not at all an ideal scenario to be leading a division. And I think one perspective is that no matter how bad the plans were and some of the mistakes that happened at Arnhem, there's not a lot wrong with the raw material. There are some very, very good officers and very good men. And we see that in the perimeter at Oosterbeek.
Well, that's a very good point, Jerry. Yeah. That even those who are, and I'm kind of in that area, that Gavin should have focused more on the bridge and less at the Grosbeak Heights. You can't criticize Gavin as a hands-on, get the job done commander. The guy had a track record, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and beyond. Market Garden certainly wasn't his high spot of his career, but saying he was a bad commander, and the same with Urquhart. People are mentioning the fact he'd been chief of staff at the Battle of Mareth in Tunisia, and he'd done a brilliant command of 231 Brigade in Sicily. We did a show about that. So Urquhart's been there and done it, not with Airborne Forces, but he's a capable commander and capable of pulling victories out of the jaws of defeat, so to speak. So the personnel is good.
The potential's there. It's almost the equivalent of having a football team where you've got really good players, really good, and for whatever reason off the field stuff's wrong, or the owner demands the wrong things. It's you can see that the potential's there.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But I think there's a few things we can say looking at this. That Market Garden doesn't start on the 10th of September. The roots go back much further, arguably as far as June, but particularly as far as late August. The issues between Browning and Brereton meant that Airborne Forces are very vulnerable to relationship issues, not just relationship issues, but inter-allied, intra-service. This is all extremely complex. The Air Force is clearly dominating planning, so we've talked about flak again and again throughout all of this. But I think what we can see is that what comes before something, or even things that don't happen, can tell us a lot about things that did happen. And often when we're looking at these battles and these campaigns that have been really well written about, there is new stuff we can find. And if we cast our net a bit wider, whether that's before or after or looking at different aspects, there is always more that we can find out, even 80 years on.
And more questions to ask, even if we can't answer them. So, well, absolutely brilliant, James. We've got a few comments and questions to go. And as I would have predicted, the sidebar is divided between those who think it was doomed from the start and it might have worked. I mean, I think there are times I lean very much to it was never going to work. And there are other times I lean very much to the, but for a few changes, who knows? I think that's anybody who weighs up evidence like that and is honest about it. There are merits to the plan and there are clear faults to the plan. That's you'd have to be blind not to notice that. But I'll give you some of the representative comments. So with Comet, Zane is asking, was there ever a plan to land on Delan airfield to neutralize the flak guns?
I don't know. I didn't see anything because I looked very much at Linnet and Comet. I didn't actually look at Market Garden all that much. I've got a feeling that Delan was very much in the exploitation plan, because obviously capturing an airfield, it's not all that far from Arnhem. That was part of the plan. I think to land 52nd Division, that would have meant neutralising the flak guns. That was, and there was, I believe there was a subsequent plan being drawn up for after Market Garden,
Yeah.
Operation Gatwick, I want to say. I might be wrong on that, but there was thinking about what would happen afterwards, and it would be interesting to look at that.
Thank you. The other comments are about people like Dempsey, you know, and whether Second Army's involvement in the planning has been rather overlooked. We focus on the people in charge of the airborne, the part of it, but actually, you know, Dempsey. I mean, the whole question. I know we're verging into Market Garden rather than Comet now, but the fact that you mentioned that as Browning, even in Comet, the plan was there for Browning to have his headquarters there on that first lift on that first day. But someone said, but wasn't it Dempsey who suggested that Browning should have his headquarters there on the first day? Is that something you found in the Comet research?
In the short answer, no. The long answer, I think historians have debated that, obviously. Yeah. And I think one of the feelings was that Montgomery went forwards, you know, with his TAC HQ, and he expected his commanders to go forwards rather than their subordinates to come back. So Browning taking his headquarters in a way, there is an argument that he was doing what 21st Army Group was expected to do at the time. So you don't expect your men to come back to you, you go forwards to them. And I think, yeah, there is some sense in that, because that is how 21st Army Group was fighting its battles in 1944.
That's a good point.
But there is also the suggestion that Browning simply wanted to get in on it and to polish his CV, which probably has some merit as well.
There's some truth there. And again, if Market Garden had worked, we'd never be analysing whether or not him bringing his headquarters was a wise in 38 gliders. It's only because it didn't work. So therefore, people have looking for who was Jack the Ripper. People have been looking to point a finger at this is where it went wrong for 80 years. I'm sure people at the bloody bridge 7 days in were already discussing whose fault it was and why they're in that predicament. So yeah, that's the coup de main bits you talked about for Nijmegen and Eindhoven. Would that have been in Comet? Would that have been at night? Marcus Sparks was asking. Would that have been just ahead of in daytime of the big drops?
I'm fairly certain that would have been first light.
Right.
I can't remember. Or I would have to look at my own book, because obviously there's lots of times and dates and places. I can't remember all of it. I've got a feeling it's first light. So they would have been taking off in the dark and landing at first light. So it's making use of darkness for the approach. Okay. I think is the key thing there.
So when we were talking about the fact the Comet may or may not have worked because it could have been 9 or 10 days earlier, Sheldrake made the good point. Would 30 Corps have been ready 9 days earlier? We learned on the other show with Edwin last week that 8th and 12th Corps were barely ready on the 17th of September. Then he added, from checking the Project 44 website, that there was a good indication of where the ground forces were. Looks like by the 14th of September, 30 Corps was in place. So 3 days earlier may have been doable, but not 9. But then again, if Comet had been agreed 9-10 days earlier, would the efforts have been made? Clearly, they would have been made to push 30 Corps up and maybe give them, I don't know, the air support and artillery support that need to be in place. But it does remind us that getting an airborne operation off the ground, pardon the pun, does involve getting a lot of places on the chessboard in the right place before you even start.
Yeah, and I think the other thing with maps is that it's not just where 30 Corps is, it's what's in front of 30 Corps.
Yeah, exactly, where the Germans are.
Yeah, because 30 Corps done the Great Swan's been a very significant drive from effectively from the Seine to Brussels in days, really. So they've gone a long way, but they're obviously stretching their lines of communication. They're probably quite tired, but they've shown that they can do it. And Horrocks in particular as well is, a master at motivating troops to drive a long way very fast.
Yeah.
So there's lots of moving parts here, aren't there? It's difficult to say yes or no to a lot of this stuff.
Well, exactly. I mean, they're in some ways they're rhetorical questions because we can't answer because we can war game this, but we can't actually put it and test it. So, but just give you an idea of the representative views from people. We have agree with Paul on this. Market Garden might have worked, a couple of tweaks, a couple of breaks going the other way, and they might have pulled it off, got 30 Corps over the Rhine. And then someone else said it. Broderick said the concept of circumventing the Siegfried line was solid. It was a plan that flawed. it was flawed, and other people say it was doomed from the beginning. So we're getting that range of views. If it had worked, what next? How quick to react? Was it just biting the tiger on the tail? Was there a fast follow-up available? So that's, there's the what would have happened in the weeks that followed. Mad Cat saying, was it Market Garden or the German response that caused it to be a failure? And these are all questions that we can and we could answer, but we're kind of not going to. Some we can't. But it proves that people have got a huge interest in this, and this idea of there's a feeling of it tantalizingly it might have worked, and therefore when Ipswich was stuffed by Manchester United 9-0, however many years ago that was, when the 6th goal comes in, there's no way Ipswich are going to get back from that. But if you lose a match 2-1 or 3-2, there's always that feeling in the pub that you might have gone a bit further. And I think for me, Market Garden, there's enough of it that did work for us to just think, nudge it that way, nudge it a bit there, have that work. And I think we all can see it going over the line, even though we can see the flaws in the plan. I think that's where I sit anyway.
I think a sports psychologist would call it marginal gains. So on their own, a lot of these things aren't major, but if you put a couple of them together, they're greater than the sum of their parts, and it starts to tip the balance. I think that's my sort of non-war studies analysis of it, I would say.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And the final question is about your research work. And I'm sure there's a bigger answer, but Trevor is saying, are copies of these documents at the Airborne Museum in Duxford?
So most of my research was the National Archives at Kew, because they're the national repository for official documents. So war diaries, planning documents, that sort of stuff. And the maps and plans and charts come with those. That's probably your first port of call if you want to do any research like this. Duxford do have copies of some of these. They also have oral histories. The Imperial War Museum is also useful as well, because they've got some of the key officers' personal papers. So Urquhart's private papers are at IWM. They've got Hollingshurst, who was one of the senior RAF transport commanders. And the beauty of these is they're often some of their official documents, but also memoirs that they drafted up after the war, some of them that haven't been published. So it's about balancing all those different sources, and a map can only tell you certain things, whereas an oral history can be really interesting, but something that's recorded 30 years later can have its flaws too. So it's about putting all of that stuff together and working out what they can tell you.
Yep, and I'm guessing Trevor's saying you've got American archives for some of the first Allied Airborne Army, and Brereton's diaries is American side of things as well.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of the SHAEF and Allied Airborne Army documents were copied and retained by the National Archives after the war, which is really, really useful. The American National Archives are increasingly digitizing a lot of their files as well, so a lot of those are available. I would have loved to have gone over to America to look at the archives. The Eisenhower Library have got some of the key staff officers' diaries and papers. If I could think of an excuse to get to Abilene, Kansas to have a look at them, I would love to. But if someone else wants to pick up on that and run with it, that's great. That's history. It's constantly people picking up and.
Well, I think that's where we are with this. To bring this to an end, is that Market Garden, the operation may be over, and the famous 90% successful, but the discussion about it won't be over yet in our lifetimes. There are so many variables, so many what ifs, so many interpretations of the personalities that are so dependent on this. I think Brereton and Browning's relationship is a big personal dynamic that we don't look at enough. We think of Patton and Montgomery, we think, MacArthur and Nimitz, things like that, von Rundstedt and Rommel. But okay, this is at a slightly lower level. But the Browning Brereton relationship is key to a lot of this as well, in that they are so different, and yet there's clearly tension there. And I think that has a huge aspect as well. Add Monty's ego as well, add Dempsey, add all these other players in there. There's a lot of personal dynamics that add to this solid interpretation of the maps and the plans that just fuels our ongoing interest in this. And that's where I am with that. You've answered lots of questions, but you've also posed lots of others. I think they're my favorite kind of show, frankly, and my favorite kind of books to read.
It's a bit of a running theme of all my appearances, isn't it? Just as many questions as answers.
Well, that's it. I mean, I think that's exactly the nature of what you're doing. It's because you're talking about things that didn't happen. You can't run the test. You can't scientifically. We can look at exactly how the Normandy jumps work because we know what happened. We can look at Martin Garden, we look at fasting, but these have this tantalizing, as I keep using that word, glimpse to something that might have happened but didn't. You can't really dissect it beyond just, well, maybe, and there we are. That's it. Fascinating stuff. But the books are, so the links to the books are in the description below, and you can follow James on social media for more. Tomorrow, we're taking a sojourn away from Market Garden for a bit. We're looking at Spies with James Crossland, a fantastic show. And then Roger Cirillo is on Friday, and we're looking at the whole big, broad front, narrow front strategy from Normandy right up to Market Garden. I've seen Roger's 44 slides. He's prepared for that, full of maps. That'll be lots more stuff to debate about the whole basic arc of what the Allies have been planning after D-Day up to September. So I've really been enjoying this whole discussion we've had about this period is so much more than just Normandy, Market Garden, Brittany, Paris. It's been fantastic. But James, it's been great talking to you, folks. I'll see you all again tomorrow. Click like and subscribe, buy my guest books. This is Paul Willett for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.